Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and tonight on our ATHENAEUM, I'm proud to bring you THEOSOPHIA, Esoteric Studies with Lynne Salomon Miceli. Greetings, Lynne. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much, Hercules.
I'm
My
looking
guest,
at that show.
okay, thank you. My guest tonight is Ed Foote, who's going to be talking about Jesus and the Essenes. Ed's two spiritual paths are the Casey readings and the book A Course in Miracles. Just for anybody who doesn't know, maybe there are some out there, Edgar Casey was an American psychic and mystic who lived from 1877 to 1945 and gave over 14,000 psychic readings that were taken down by a stenographer. His readings covered topics ranging from remedies for illnesses, spiritual development, reincarnation and karma, ancient cultures, including Atlantis and Egypt, and about Jesus and the early church. Ed has been a student of the Casey readings and the Course in Miracles for over 30 years. He travels around the country lecturing on these topics. As a layperson, he has led over 400 church services for Unity, Presbyterian, and metaphysical churches all over the US. He has also taught sacred dance at churches from coast to coast. He's a full-time square dance caller, having called for over 50 years in every state in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, and has a home program of square dance clubs in the Pittsburgh area. So he speaks on a lot of topics, but tonight, because we're recording this on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, we're going to talk about Jesus and the Essenes. So welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. So the Casey readings give a lot of information about Jesus and the people close to him. And according to the readings, the Essenes had a lot to do with the birth of Jesus. But before we talk about that, let's kind of go back to the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about the Essenes, who they were, where they came from?
Yes, the Essenes, most people never heard of the Essenes until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. By the way, all my material tonight comes from the Edgar Casey readings. Edgar Casey actually talked about the Essenes as far back as 1932, but because virtually nobody had heard about the Essenes, why he was just kind of dismissed and wasn't paid any attention to. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran in 1947. In between 1947 and 1955, over 800 of these scrolls were discovered. And when I say scrolls, I don't mean just a little small piece of paper. I mean big, huge scrolls like books. So if you talk like 800 books, there's a lot of material there. And that's when the scrolls are considered to have been written by the Essenes. And that's when the Essenes first came into prominence.
How did these readings about the Essenes, how did it come up in the readings, in Edgar Casey's readings?
They came up in the readings because Edgar Casey, he gave over 14,000 readings in his lifetime. 60% of these were on health and wellness, and there was a stenographer there who took down the information. Once people discovered that the information on health and wellness was accurate and people were actually healed as a result of the Casey readings, then people said, well, maybe let's ask him some questions on other subjects. Maybe he can tell us things about the pyramids in Egypt or Atlantis or the lost books of the Bible or the story of Jesus. And what about the missing years in his life that isn't mentioned in the Bible? So people ask him about Jesus, how Mary came to be selected as the mother of Jesus, what happened once Jesus was born. In the Bible, there's nothing mentioned between age 12 and age 30. What did he do there? And so different people ask him these questions, and that's how all this information about Jesus and the Essenes came forth from Casey.
Some of it came from life readings too. Casey would do readings for people about their previous lives, their past lives, and some of those people were Essenes. Some of them were in the family of Jesus, but that's skipping ahead a little bit. So can you tell us the story from Mount Carmel through the birth of Jesus in the stables and all that?
All right. Well, we'll back up a little bit here. When Casey talks about the souls coming into Earth. He said it before any souls came into Earth, we were all like flocks of birds flying. You've seen these nature videos where all the flocks of birds swoop one way and swoop another, or fish in the ocean, big schools of them all at the same time move one way or the other. Well, that's the way we were. And we were all happy and content and doing this. And then we saw Earth, and some of us decided, let's get down to Earth and see what's there. And we became so enamored of the physicality of Earth that we decided to stay. And then those that didn't go to Earth saw that their fellow souls were trapped in Earth and came down to rescue them. They got trapped too, and that's the whole history in a nutshell of what Casey said was the history of how souls came into Earth. So even though we were here in Earth, we were still together in groups. And by groups, I mean things like families, neighborhoods, cultures, faiths, and then it broke down into families and businesses and schools, teams, something like this. A good example of this would be the Spirit of 76, which led to the founding of the United States. And although individual people within, at the time of the Revolutionary War, had different ideas about how the revolutionary spirit should be conducted, those that wanted to separate from Britain were all in harmony on the ideal. And that was the key. They were in harmony and they were on the ideal of wanting to separate from Europe. Soul groups are not static and rigid. So an individual can use free will at any time to move to another group, change a religion, this kind of thing. A father and son in one lifetime might be a mother and daughter in another lifetime. So although soul groups are well established and have significant pull on the individuals in them, none of them have greater power over us than our own free will. Our own free will is the ultimate controller. And people would come back into life. Casey was big on reincarnation. And so he said that soul groups tend to cycle in and out of Earth together at approximately the same time. And by the same time, I don't mean days or years. I mean things like eras or ages. Most of Casey's past life readings were for soul groups that fell into one of two major groups. He called them Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 was early Atlantis, early ancient Egypt, Persia, Palestine at the time of Jesus, the Crusades, and colonial America. These souls were in Group 1. And then Group 2 was late Atlantis, late Egypt, early Greece, Rome at the time of Jesus, France during the reigns of Louis XIV, XV, and XVI, and the American Civil War. So you mentioned about people that had lived at the time of Jesus and were Essenes. When people went to Casey for a life reading, and he would tell them, here's what you did in a previous life. And excuse me, I'm going to disconnect that phone here. All right, well, that was taken care of. When people ask, when Casey would tell somebody about a previous life, he might say, you lived at the time of Jesus, and maybe you were an Essene, or maybe you were a Roman soldier, or maybe you were just an average citizen, whatever. So a number of people that went to Casey for readings discovered that they had been present at the time of Jesus in a wide range of roles. And Casey named specific people and told them, well, you were this person back at that time, or this other person. Some groups of souls find themselves together again and again over the ages, and maybe they didn't want to be together, but they're together anyway, and the reason for that is karma. Souls must meet the effects of past actions on each other. And of course, there's good karma and bad karma, and that's a whole nother talk. But that's how people that were Essenes before have come back into Earth at this time too, and they have different things to do at this time. I think that covers that area.
And the Essenes, can you give a little background about the Essenes, where did they, their history before the time of Jesus?
Yeah, the Essenes were a group of people who were looking for the Messiah. And they said, there's no way the Messiah is going to come into Earth with the Earth being in all this turmoil. I mean, if you think the Earth is in turmoil now, it was in just as much turmoil back then. It just wasn't as geographically widespread. So there were wars and fighting and disagreements and all this kind of thing. And so this group of people said, the Messiah is never going to come to Earth when he sees all this negativity going on. So we're going to separate ourselves. We're going to go off and form our own community and communities, and we're going to live a really religious, spiritual life. And God and the Holy Spirit and Messiah and Christ will see this, see that there are good people here on earth, and that will attract Jesus, that will attract the Messiah into the earth. So the Essenes first started around the year 300 BC, and they continued to exist until about the year 73 AD, 73 years after Jesus was born. So the Essenes, there were many communities of Essenes. The main ones were at Qumran and in Palestine area, but eventually Essene communities were established all over in Persia, Egypt, in all different areas. But the Essenes' goal was to live a very spiritual life so that this would attract the coming of the Messiah into the earth.
And I think that you trace them back to the school for prophets that Samuel started up Samuel in the Bible, the prophet Samuel.
Right. It goes way back. By the way, the word Essenes means expectancy. The Essenes expected the Messiah to come to earth. So yes, there were schools from way back that started that preceded the Essenes, and that's a whole nother topic and historians get into. But tonight we're going to focus really just on the Essenes.
Okay. So
did you want to discuss about the three different sects that existed?
all right. Yeah, there were, right. So yes, there were three different sects of Judaism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is important. When Christ was born, three sects, and that's SECTS, three sects existed in Palestine: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Now, the Bible never mentions the Essenes, and the reason for this is the Essenes were the outcasts of their day. They were like the hippies of the day. So they lived off out in the wilderness and out in the desert, and nobody paid them any attention. So even though the modern day Bible was composed some 300 years after Christ's death, the Essenes were still considered just irrelevant. They weren't a factor, so why put them in the Bible? So that's why the Essenes are never mentioned in the Bible. Now, the other two sects that are in the Bible are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I want to run over these just real briefly because we read the Bible and we see these terms, Pharisees and Sadducees, and we don't know what they mean. There's a group of people. So I'm going to give you a brief outline of what the Pharisees believed and what the Sadducees believed. So the Pharisees were the most numerous of the three sects. They started about 200 years before Christ. And these were the priests and the scribes and the common people, and they believed in the Mosaic law, but they also believed that interpretations by the scribes were equally valid. the Pharisees placed religion above politics. They could live with any government as long as this government did not restrict their religious freedom. So the Pharisees got along well with the Romans. The Pharisees believed in the following items. They believed in immortality of the soul. They believed in retribution in the afterlife. They believed in angels, the resurrection of the just. They believed that God cooperates in human acts. They believed in free will. And they believed that the Messiah would free the Jews from foreign domination. The Sadducees, they were never as numerous as the Pharisees, but they were very influential because their members included the nobility, the wealthy, and the higher-ranking priests. The Sadducees believed in free will, but they didn't believe in a lot of other things. They didn't believe in retribution. They rejected resurrection, angels, spirits. They rejected scribal interpretation of the law. They rejected answered prayer. They rejected divine guidance, and they had little belief in the Messiah. And you can see why they would think this way. They're the rulers, they're the nobles, they have all the money. So why should we believe in anything else than ourselves? So the Pharisees said Jesus could not have been the Messiah because he came on the scene as a carpenter instead of a king. The Sadducees said Jesus was a political rabble-rouser who had to be crushed in order to protect their own position. So that's why both the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not really, as a political group, embrace Jesus. The Essenes, as I said, the Essenes were the third sect, S-E-C-T, that were expecting the Messiah to come. The Essenes were wealthy, but they lived modestly. And when you joined the Essenes after a few years, you were expected to give all of your possessions to the community to use as a whole. And as I said, the Essenes had numerous communities, some as far away as India. The key is the purpose of the Essenes. Individual preparation for spiritual growth. That's the purpose of the Essenes. Individual preparation for spiritual growth. And then there was a secondary purpose. And the secondary purpose was to prepare enlightened people to go out into the world as light bearers to counterbalance the darkness of selfishness, materialism, and worldliness that was rampant in the world at that time. Actually, the Essenes, as Lynn mentioned, they were first started at the School of the Prophets, begun by Melchizedek back 2250 BC. And then the prophet Samuel reestablished the school, and then the Essene community reestablished again and reestablished as an Essene community in the about 300 BC. I'll briefly mention a few things about the Essenes. There's a lot of confusion about what the Essenes believed, and that's because there were so many different communities. So one community would believe one thing, and then another community 500 miles away, they said, well, we're going to believe our things. And so there's confusion. Even though we have these scrolls, there's confusion on the scrolls too. Some people say the Essenes were celibate, but researchers of Qumran found the graves of women and children, and also a scroll called the Community Scroll that contained regulations governing how marriage should be conducted and the raising of children. Some people say that the Essenes were pacifists, but there was also discovered a war scroll. And the war scroll had things like how to make weapons. And Qumran was a fortified site, and there was a forge there for making weapons. One of the early scholars, named Philo, he wrote the Essenes had no animal sacrifice, but a scroll found at Qumran was called the Temple Scroll, and that contained instructions for conducting animal sacrifice. So again, we had all these differences because there were variations in the Essene community because there were so many different towns and settlements. So some Essenes were pacifists, some were warriors. Some conducted animal sacrifice, some didn't. What did Casey say about the Essenes? Well, as I mentioned, the key is expectancy. They believed in the coming of the Messiah, and they believed in this prophecy. This prophecy is in the Bible. It's in Daniel chapter 9, verses 25, 26. This was a prophecy given to Daniel by the archangel Gabriel. The Essenes considered women to be equals with men. And so women were allowed to serve in temple ceremonies. Now that was for the Essenes, not for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You might remember in the Bible, in Luke chapter 2, verse 36, 38, the baby Jesus is shown to a female prophet in the temple. Well, the only temple that will allow such a thing to occur was the Essene temple on Mount Carmel. The scrolls were found in Qumran in caves there. The headquarters of the Essenes was in Mount Carmel, about 22 miles away. So Jesus didn't just appear suddenly in the earth. He was the result of 300 years of Essene efforts to prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah spirit and the Messiah consciousness into the earth.
So tell us about that. How did they prepare?
Well, they prepared, again, they were looking for the Messiah to come into the earth. So their preparation was they wanted to prepare someone in their community to be the mother of the Messiah. So the Essenes were looking for a special young woman who would be the channel or a light teacher of a light teacher from God, i.e. the Messiah. So the Essenes would select about 12 or 16 women, and they would give them special education. And they would select these girls as early as age 4. They were dedicated by their parents, and then around age 8 or 9, the girls would recommit themselves, and they would be in this special school to be trained to be a possible mother for Jesus. So all the candidates, as I said, were first dedicated by their parents when they were real young. And then later on, each girl gave her own personal commitment. And for the Messiah's birth, 12 young girls were chosen from many who had been dedicated by their parents. But this procedure had been going on for hundreds of years, way back, maybe not starting in the year 300, but shortly thereafter. And these young girls would be in this special school, and they would stay in the special school until age 16. And once they hit age 16, they aged out of the school, and new girls were coming in at a very young age, and they were aging out at age 16. And this is kept repeating over and over again, with the hope that the whole Essene community would be seen to be so spiritual in nature that this would attract the Messiah in, and one of these young girls would be the mother of Jesus.
Because the whole community was super spiritual, but these young girls were even more so. They were set apart and trained especially for that.
Right. They were restricted from activities and associations that normal young women engaged in. The prevailing idea of the time would be what was an ideal woman, attractive, has beauty, sensual, appealing to men. Well, none of this was part of the training of the 12 or so girls that were in training. I'll list you some of the things that these girls learned each day. they considered lessons in the destiny of humanity as souls, lessons in discussion about original creation. In other words, they're studying really deep things here. They studied divine service and being channels of light in the world. They listened to music that raised the soul and the mind. They involved themselves in praying, in singing, in caring for others, doing good in the community. They practiced the fruits of the Spirit. Fruits of the Spirit is very important in all of the Casey readings. It's found in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. There are 9 fruits of the Spirit there. I encourage everyone to write these down, because anytime you have a question of what to do with your life or what path to follow, you have these 9 in Galatians, and you can just throw a dart at any one of them, and any one of them is going to be a good path for you to follow. In addition, Casey and others have listed other fruits of the Spirit. The Course in Miracles lists some. So overall, there's 25 or more different fruits of the Spirit. But the easy way for you to find these quick first 9 and where this started was in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. Also, these girls drank no wine, and they ate special foods. So these 12 girls were very busy all of the time. And now, do you want me to go into the selection of Mary?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. All right, so how was Mary selected to be the mother of Jesus? Well, her mother, Anna, brought her to the temple at age 4 and, quote, dedicated her. Now, Anna claimed that Mary had been conceived without knowing a man. Casey said this wasn't so, but he also said, yes, there are 2 different readings. One says yes, one says no, so we don't really know. Now, some in the Essene community doubted this because this sort of went against natural law, but because Mary was perfect in body and mind for service, she was accepted into this group of special girls. Now, each day, the 12 girls climbed the temple steps to visit the altar, and a different girl would lead the procession single file each day. And they started off at the temple for prayer and to burn incense. One day, when she was 13, Mary was the one that led the procession to the temple. And Casey said that Mary had chestnut hair and brown eyes. And as Mary led this procession of girls to the temple, all 12 were bathed in bright morning light, which made all of them look as though they were clothed in purple and gold. There were a number of Essene teachers and elders watching this procession. They watched it every day. I'll mention a couple of names because they're important later on. 2 of the teachers, Matthias and Enos, were watching the procession, and also was a lady named, or a girl at this time, named Judy, who one day would be the teacher of Jesus. Now, imagine this line of 12. Next in line behind Mary was Josie, Josie. She had become like a sister to Mary. Next in line, number 3, was Jenife, Jenife. She was a year younger than Mary. Then, continuing back, was a person named Andra, Andra, Sophia, Sophia, and then another Mary. And all 12 or all 11 of these other girls remained friends with Mary and Jesus all of their lives. Now, further back in the line was a girl named Edithia, Edithia. She and Jenife were sisters, and they were daughters of an innkeeper in Bethlehem. So now I'll give you exactly what happened when Mary was selected to be the mother of the Messiah. And I'm going to read from a book called A Christmas Story as Told by Edgar Casey. Normally I don't read from books in my talks, but I'm going to read 3 quick little paragraphs here because this says it better than I can say it. This book, entitled A Christmas Story, was published by the ARE Press, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. That's the home of all the Edgar Cayce readings. And all this information comes from reading number 2067-11, if anybody wanted to resource this. And more information was come from a reading number 5749-8. So here is how the actual selection occurred, reading from this book. As Mary reached the top step, there was thunder and lightning. She stood still, her eyes looking up in radiant wonder and awe. A great halo of light formed around her, and within the light, the angel Gabriel appeared, taking the child by the hand before the altar. Wide-eyed, Judy stood still. Matthias drew in his breath sharply, and Enos stifled a cry. This was the manner of choice. This was the showing of the way, for Mary had led the others on this day. After a moment, the vision ended, and Judy directed the girls to take their usual places. Josie and Judith were stunned by what had happened to Mary. It would be 3 more years before Mary would conceive the Christ child, and longer still before she would join Joseph. But as that time approached, the famed wise men had already begun their journey, and Mary's teacher Judy had begun to play a role in what would now unfold in the land. Now, the schooling for these 12 was completed about 3 years after Gabriel appeared to Mary on the stairs, and all of these 12 girls went home. And at age 16, and by the way, that ends the reading there. That reading from that book is now over. At age 16, Mary had become a beautiful young woman. Now, one day when she was alone, and this information still, of course, comes from the Cayce readings, one day when she was alone, Gabriel suddenly appeared to her and said, "Hail, you are highly favored. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women." And Mary was troubled, concerned, as I guess anybody would be if they saw an angel in front of them. But Gabriel said, "Fear not, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you shall conceive in your womb and bring forth the son." Mary asked, "Well, how could this happen?" And Gabriel said, "You will be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit and conceive a child, and his name shall be Jesus, and he will be known as the Son of God." And Gabriel also said that Mary's cousin Elizabeth, who many people thought was too old to have children, was now expecting a son. Let's briefly look at this idea of the Immaculate Conception. I mean, some people say Immaculate Conception was not in compliance with natural law, but Cayce said that spiritual conceptions were natural. Natural as demonstrated by the projection of mind into matter. Remember that Cayce said we originally were all souls swirling around in the universe, in the ethers, and we saw Earth and we projected ourselves into Earth, into matter in the Earth. So that's the same way that Immaculate Conception can happen, and why Cayce said this is natural, because it's the same idea. So it's similar to the way the first souls came into the Earth. So the Immaculate Conception means that the physical and mental are so attuned to spirit as to be quickened, it's a term, quickened by it. So the soul of Jesus could come into the earth through the attunement of Mary to spirit.
That was the whole point of all that preparation for all those girls for 300 years.
Right.
That's
right.
Pretty awesome accomplishment.
Now, while Mary was pregnant, she visited her cousin Elizabeth, who was much older, and when Elizabeth saw Mary, she realized that Mary's baby would become the Messiah, and that her own child, Elizabeth's child, would help prepare people to receive him. And of course, Elizabeth's child was John the Baptist. Elizabeth had her baby first, then came, and that was John the Baptist, but he was not called the Baptist until after his death. A brief item on Joseph. Joseph knew about the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary on the temple steps, but it wasn't until 3 years later, at age 36, that he was told about the role that he would play in this whole, in this whole scenario. Naturally, in that time period, most Jewish families had marriage arrangements made by the parents. But for Anna and Mary, it was questioned whether they belonged to any family, because remember, Anna said Mary was conceived immaculately. So Joseph received the news of his part that he would play first in a dream and then by direct voice, accompanied by fragrances and visions. And initially he was disturbed about this because he was so much older than Mary. He was 36 and she was 16. He was disturbed by what people would say about this age difference. But once he was assured that his role was divine will, then he agreed to play his part. They were married at the temple at Mount Carmel. She was 36. He was age 16. Sorry, I said that backwards. He was 36. She was age 16. During her pregnancy, Mary spent most of her time in the hills of Judea and only a small portion of her time with Joseph in Nazareth. So that's how Mary was selected to be the mother of Jesus.
And now Casey describes the birth or the circumstances around the birth.
Circumstances of the birth are very interesting. Back then, you had to pay your taxes in the town in which you were born. So Joseph was born in Bethlehem, so he had to go there to pay his taxes. Now, it's interesting, if you see pageants conducted by Sunday schools or school plays, who is the villain in this whole scenario of the birth of Jesus? The answer is the innkeeper, because he told Mary and Joseph, "Be gone." Well, Casey gives us the rest of the story. The innkeeper was named Apsaphar, Apsaphar. He was a closet Essene. He was an Essene. He just didn't tell many people about it. He was the father of Adithia and Judith, who were two of the girls in this line of 12. So he had seen a vision. He knew who Mary and Joseph were. He had seen the star in the east. So at the time of when people go to pay their taxes, this was the only time of the year everybody could get together. So while we think of paying taxes as a kind of a bad time, back then it was kind of like the Super Bowl and Christmas and 4th of July all rolled into one. It was a big, gigantic celebration. Food, drinking, carousing, all of this, everybody celebrating. And where did you do this? You did this at the inns, because that's where the food and the drink were. So Apsaphar recognized that this was no place for the Messiah to be born, in this atmosphere of drunkenness and all this partying going on. So when Mary and Joseph appeared, he said in a very loud voice to them, "No room at the inn," because he didn't want anybody in the inn to think these were special people and maybe bother them. So he didn't want to go up to them and whisper silently, "I go over there to the stable." That would look to the other people as though he was doing something special with these people, and maybe then the people in the inn would follow these people out and see what was going on. So his loud announcement was so that everybody in the inn could hear this and then not bother Mary and Joseph. Now, Apsaphar had another daughter. Her name was Sarapha, Sarapha. She was 1 year younger than Mary, and she had attended some Essene classes out at Mount Carmel. She just didn't live there. She lived with her father and mother in Bethlehem. And she decided ahead of time to prepare the stable. She didn't know why. She just thought, "I'm going to prepare the stable in case it's needed." And obviously it was needed. So Casey says the birth occurred about midnight. Saratha, the daughter who prepared the stable, was there. So was her mother. Everybody saw the star. Everybody heard the angels sing, including the people in the inn. And the angels were singing peace on earth, goodwill to all of good faith. Now, some people in the inn made fun of all this, but other people realized that some of the unkind things that they had said or done in their life and maybe needed corrected. The shepherds were there. And then we need to look briefly at the wise men. Who were the wise men? They were people who looked for and sought a better understanding of God's laws. They were called the wise ones or the sages. And they were in accord with the high purposes held by Jesus. So the wise men used psychic ability and astrology to find the place where Jesus was. Now, Casey says the wise men arrived 2 to 3 weeks after the birth. So the typical manger scene that shows the wise men there, that's convenient, but Casey said that isn't, excuse me, that isn't quite the way it happened. The 3 wise men represent in a metaphysical sense the 3 phases of human experience in materiality. The 3 gifts they gave: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold is the material, and that represents the body. Frankincense is the ethereal, that represents the mind. And myrrh is the healing force, and that represents the soul. Casey said, we are body, mind, and soul, and the 3 gifts from the wise men represent that. The wise men were represented as an encouragement for Mary and for everyone who nourished and cherished the birth of the Messiah. In other words, if these wise men are going to show up, this is a big deal, and we should really pay attention here. Now, Casey says there were more than 3 wise men. There was also a 4th and a 5th. And then there was a second group of wise men. And these wise men came from all over. They came from Egypt, Persia, India, Indochina, Gobi. You've heard of the Gobi Desert. They kept coming back on a regular basis because they were interested. Remember, they had the same ideals as Jesus, so they wanted to oversee Jesus's life. So they kept coming back several times, different ones at different times, to Galilee to visit Jesus and his family. They wanted to keep up with Jesus's progress. Now, at age 12, and in those days, age 12 was the age of maturity, like 18 is today. So at age 12, the Magi took Jesus to their temples in Persia, India, and Egypt for final training. And that information also comes from Edgar Casey. Of course, all of this information comes from Casey. So that's the story of the birth and the wise men and how they all came to play a part there.
Before Jesus was taken to other countries and other cultures for training, he was trained by the Essenes, right? I think that's where Judith or Judy comes back into this story.
Right. Judy was very important. At the time of Mary's selection on the stairs, Judy was 21. She was one of the teachers at the Essenes Temple in Mount Carmel. She eventually became the formal leader of the Essenes. She was the primary teacher at the Essenes Temple, and she was a healer, and she had the gifts of prophecy. She was also one of the primary contacts for the wise men. Wise men wanted to better understand the meaning of the birth of Jesus. But Judy's greatest role was as a teacher of young Jesus, especially between the ages of 12 and 16. It was Judy who reconnected Jesus with the Magi when he became of age, and she was the one that arranged for him to go with the Magi to study in the East because she wanted him to study astrology.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit. I think you said that he was taken at 12 to all these other countries, but maybe he was taken at 12 to Judy and then at 16 to these other countries?
Well, he was he was taken to other countries, but he didn't spend all his time there. He kept
I see. He came
coming back and forth. So she was the primary teacher of Jesus at age 12. She was also teaching him before that. She taught him in her home, but there were other people in the Essene community that were also teaching Jesus. But at age 12, now she controlled everything. She was the main teacher when he was in the Essene community, and she was the one that arranged for him to go off and study in other lands. Now, Judy's powers were supernatural. Casey said, and this is a quote, Judy's experience at that time was such that she might be present in many places without the physical body being there. So Casey said that Judy and Jesus could have conversations during his ministry wherever he was. She remained physically at the temple of Mount Carmel, but she could talk with Jesus while he was off doing his ministry, because she could locate herself in two distinct places at the same time. So what did Judy teach Jesus? Well, Casey said she taught him in her home about the prophecies pertaining to the mission of the Messiah and the preordained experiences that the Messiah would suffer. Casey was asked, why wasn't Judy born a boy? And Casey said it was from the powers on high and demonstrated God's view of woman's place in the affairs of humanity. Casey said that male dominance was due to man's misconception of the woman's role in the fall in the Garden of Eden. Remember, I said the Essenes considered women equal to men and even had women priests and prophets. Now, we should note that in the Bibles of the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, there's a book of Judith. And this was written 100 years before our Judy, and it's not about her. But it is a very great book. Martin Luther translated it and put it in his Bible. And it's considered by scholars as a very creative history with inspiring stories. So Judy may have been named Judy because of this book.
Right, because the Judith in that book was a real heroine.
Right. Now, why did the wise men go to Herod before they went to the manger? Herod was only number 2 or 3 in authority. Why didn't the wise men go to the Romans, who were number 1 in authority? It was because of Judy. Judy considered Herod a bad ruler because he sought only to boost himself. So she wanted him out. And she thought if he had turmoil with the Romans, maybe the Romans would kick him out. And what would upset Herod? It's important to remember that no one, not the wise men, not Judy, not the Essenes, nobody said that the new king was to replace Rome. Rather, it was to replace Jewish authority in the land. And who was Jewish authority? Herod. Herod was not a real Jew, but he called himself one so he could rule. So if the Messiah was to replace Jewish authority, that meant Herod. That's why Herod issued the edict to go out and destroy all the newborns.
That kind of backfired, didn't it? I mean, Judith wanted Herod to be replaced, and instead it led to the deaths of all these innocents.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's why we don't always know what our actions are going to result in. So let's briefly look here at the flight to Egypt. We know that Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Egypt to escape this edict from Herod that all newborns should be killed. And from reading the Bible, we might think it was Mary, Joseph, and Jesus going to Egypt alone, but this wasn't the case. Casey said the Essenes were committed to protecting the Messiah, so there were always people with the parents and with Jesus. First Judy, then the leadership of the Essenes. Someone said someone should be with the family at all times. The main person selected for this was Josie. Remember, she was number 2 in line right behind Mary, and she was like a sister to Mary. The trips to Egypt were made only at night, and they finished at Alexandria because Judy wanted Mary and Joseph and Jesus to be exposed to, and of course, Jesus was too young at the time, but Mary and Joseph to be exposed to the great library at Alexandria. And so that's the reason they finished there. The time, according to Casey, spent in Egypt was 4 years, 6 months, and 3 days. And then they returned to Judea, back to Judea. At that time, the leadership of the Essenes told Josie her job was done, but she determined to stay with Mary for the rest of her life. Joseph continued to care for the family. She was with them when they went to Jerusalem when Jesus was 12. You might remember in the Bible one place, Jesus went to the temple and his parents wondered where he was. Well, they thought he was with Josie. Josie never married. When Jesus was crucified, she was the one who brought the spices and ointments to prepare the body for burial. So Josie is an example of someone who was faithful to the very end. So after age 12, Jesus goes to Egypt, India, and Persia. Then he comes back to Judea for the death of Joseph. Then he went back to Egypt, back and forth. And then at age 30, his ministry began. And that's our history story of the whole birth of Christ.
So in this amazing story, which is really such an epical story of 300 years of preparation and incredible discipline, what messages does this have for us today?
Well, that's a good question. Casey says this isn't just a nice historical story to listen to and say, well, that's interesting. What Casey wants us to learn from this story, and what he wants us to learn is that we have the opportunity to be modern day Essenes to prepare the way for the second coming of Christ. That's the message from Casey on this whole topic. We are here to prepare the way for the second coming of Christ. Now, how will Christ come? What will be the second coming of Christ? How will Christ come? Well, there are 3 theories. One is that he will return in a fiery chariot across the heavens for everyone to see. And a couple readings from Casey actually suggested this might be the way he comes back. A second way that he might return would be to small groups of people. Like after he was resurrected, he appeared to small groups of people on the roads to different towns. And so this might be another way he might return. And a third way he might return is to individuals at different times. In other words, when he shall be perceived. This is kind of the way that I like, because this means that Jesus has already returned a second time to individuals when he shall be perceived. And I like this version because it's in line with how he came to earth the first time in a very humble fashion. I want to mention to you here, if you want to experience the second coming of Christ in the first way, in a fiery chariot across the heavens, go on the internet, go to YouTube and type in Sibelius Symphony No. 2, Sibelius, Symphony No. 2. Sibelius is a composer. He wrote Finlandia, the national anthem of Finland. He's someone I feel was touched by God. And if you go to this on your computer, and it's about 46 minutes long, and when you put your cursor on the thing and start to play the symphony, it shows the time on the bottom. Go and listen to the last 10 minutes. But you have to listen to this in a certain fashion. You have to be very quiet. You have to be in a very quiet space. Nothing, no other sounds around. You have to be very comfortable. You have to be in a meditative state. And you turn the volume up loud. So you're totally surrounded by this. And you start about minute 36, about 10 minutes from the end. And you will hear rumbling in the heavens. And the music grows and grows. And eventually you will experience the second coming of Christ. Many people have tried this, and I've told this, made this suggestion to, and they've said, yes, they do experience it, but you have to listen to it in this fashion. You can't just listen to it as there's the music and I'm here. No, you're not going to get it. You have to really prepare yourself for this. Now, we can be modern day Essenes by living our lives the way the Essenes did, studying spirituality, following the fruits of the Spirit that we mentioned in Galatians. Fruits of the Spirit, things like love, forgiveness, patience, faith, meekness, kindness, gentleness, peace, joy. We want to establish the Christ consciousness within ourselves. That's what Casey said. The second coming of Jesus will be attracted, the Christ will be attracted into earth if we establish the Christ consciousness within our minds. So we are always looking to see with the vision of Christ. Anytime a problem comes up in your life, ask yourself, how would Jesus look at this? Remember the WWJD buttons back in the 90s? What would Jesus do? Same thing. Always ask yourself, how would Jesus look at this situation? Establishing the Christ consciousness within yourself is what Casey says is vital. So what's the definition of Christ consciousness? This is the definition that Casey said is the perfect definition. The awareness within each soul. And if some of you are taking notes, I'm going to read this right through because you can go back and look at it on your video. So I'm just going to read it right through. The awareness within each soul, imprinted into pattern in the mind and merely waiting to be awakened by the will of the soul's oneness with God. What does this mean? 3 parts. The awareness within each soul. Every soul has this awareness. Whether you're born in the United States or out of Mongolia, every soul has this awareness sitting in there. And where is it sitting? It's imprinted into pattern in the mind. And it's sitting there. What's it doing? It's sitting in our mind, waiting to be awakened by our will. Casey was very big on the will. Our will controls everything. And what is sitting there, waiting to be awakened by the will? The idea of the soul's oneness with God. Casey said that the Christ journey is from the head to the heart, and it's the most important journey we will ever take. Now, there's a law of Christ consciousness. I encourage you to write this down. Look at this periodically. The law of Christ consciousness. As you become aware of your oneness, your body is filled with the light of the Christ consciousness. As you become aware of your oneness, your body is filled with the light of the Christ consciousness.
That awareness has to be more than just an intellectual concept. That has to be a living, applied awareness.
We have to live our lives this way. Casey is big about implementation. It's about activity. Casey says, what good does it do you to go to lectures and listen to these Zoom broadcasts and read all these books if you don't put it in your life? It doesn't mean anything. So Casey was big on implementation of these spiritual things that you learn. Casey said in a reading, he cannot come again until there is a seeking for him. So the preparation for the return of Christ requires an expectancy, a high standard of individual conduct. I lead church services, and I always give people a homework assignment at the end of the service. And this is what I suggest to them to do. every morning when you wake up, immediately upon waking up, before you get out of bed, say this one sentence prayer. Lord, help me be a savior to someone today. Help me be a savior to someone today. And if you do that, hopefully you will remember some of these things from this talk. Remember about the idea of the Christ consciousness, seen with the vision of Christ, and you will live your life in the way the Essenes did, and then you will prepare the earth for the second coming of Christ.
Thank you, Ed. That is an amazing story and an amazing lesson. How would people, if people wanted to know more from you or wanted to have you come and do a presentation for them, how would people get in touch with you?
Yes, they can contact me. My email address, it's Ed, well, my name again is Ed Foote, F-O-O-T-E. My email address is edcall, E-D-C-A-L-L, at Zoom, Z-O-O-M, internet.net. I'm always glad to do Zoom presentations, and I love to do in-person presentations. I live in Pittsburgh, but I travel throughout the country, especially the eastern side of the country. If you live east of the Mississippi, I can, or at some point, arrange to get to your area. I also go to California once a year. So if you're ever interested in a talk, why, I would be glad to discuss that with you. I have 13 different talks I give, all on spirituality, and would be glad to do that for you.
Thank you, Ed. And if anybody wants to reach me, I can be reached through the ARE of New York at info@edgarcaseynyc.org. I'll spell that. It's INFO, the @ symbol, EDGARCAYCE.org. So to all the people watching this, we wish you actually Christmas and Hanukkah are both the same day this year, so it's kind of nice. Everybody's celebrating at the same time. Joyful Christmas, a joyful Hanukkah. And thank you so much, Ed, for coming and telling us this story, which is such an amazing.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciated your having me here. I enjoyed it.
And thank you, Hercules, for having us both.
And thank you for hosting an excellent show. I learned a lot. It was very interesting. Thank you very much, and happy holidays to all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.